The Worthington estate had always stood like a monument to power, its towering walls whispering secrets only the dead could hear. But on this cold, mist-laden night, its silence was different, thicker, heavier, almost suffocating. Something was missing, or rather, someone. And in the heart of that emptiness, beneath the grand chandelier that once bathed the house in golden light, lay a truth so dark, so unforgiving, that even the walls could no longer keep it hidden. Tonight the Worthington legacy would shatter, not with a whisper, but with a scream. The bells of St. Mary's Hollow tolled sluggishly, their echoes unraveling the fragile morning silence that clung to the village like an uneasy ghost. The cobblestone streets, still slick with remnants of mist reluctant to part with dawn, glistened under the pale light. The air hung thick with an eerie dampness, the kind that didn't just chill flesh but settled deep into the marrow. From a modest servant's quarters tucked behind the marketplace, Clara emerged, her fingers stiff against the chilled iron handle of a water bucket, her breath curling like ghostly ribbons in the air. She had long grown accustomed to the Worthington estate's demands, early starts, swift steps, silence, but this morning felt wrong. There was something in the weight of the air, something unspoken. The estate loomed ahead, its ivy-choked stone facade resembling a fortress, keeping in secrets rather than keeping out intruders. The ground stretched out before her, pristine and controlled, yet a strange stillness pressed against her senses. It wasn't until she neared the garden hedge, where she had been tasked to set breakfast, that the unease coiled tight in her stomach turned to full-fledged dread. There, sprawled across the damp grass like a discarded marionette, lay Richard Putton, his limbs at an unnatural angle, his glassy eyes fixed on the grey sky, as if frozen mid-scream. The deep crimson of his blood painted a grotesque contrast against the vibrant green of the lawn, pooling thickly, fresh enough to glisten. In his stiff fingers clenched in a final desperate grasp, a letter bore Isabella Worthington's name. The ink, smudged and hurried, betrayed urgency, perhaps a final confession, perhaps a warning. Clara did not remember screaming, but the next thing she knew, chaos had erupted. Servants stumbled from their posts, some gasping, some whispering frenzied prayers. Within moments, the Worthington estate was a hive of restless energy, its fragile order crumbling. The constable arrived swiftly, his expression unreadable, as he took in the macabre scene. Mary's Hollow was a village bound by familiarity. Everyone knew everyone, but murder was a foreign spectre. And then came Isabella. Her entrance was not the dramatic arrival of a grieving fiancé. Rather, she moved slowly, as if wading through deep water, her face drained of color, her delicate fingers trembling against the fabric of her dress. The moment her eyes landed on Richard's lifeless form, something in her seemed to fracture. She knelt beside him, her lips parted in a silent denial before she whispered, so soft it was almost lost to the wind, I didn't do this." But words held no power in the face of suspicion. Whispers slithered among the gathering crowd. She had been the last one to see him alive. The night before, they had quarreled, or so the rumors said. The letter still clasped in Richard's death grip would soon become the most damning evidence. And then, like a shadow cutting through fog, Miss Jane Morrell arrived. She was a woman of quiet reputation, an unassuming observer of human nature, with an uncanny ability to peel back the layers of deception. The stillness in the air struck her first, an unnatural quiet that pressed too heavily for a spring morning. The placement of the body, it was wrong. The way the blood spatter lay suggested movement after death, not before. And then there was the letter, its ink not just smeared, but deliberately so, as if someone had wanted to obscure its message rather than reveal it. Her eyes flicked to Isabella, to the pallor of her face, the stiffness of her hands, the glistening moisture at her temples, not the tears of a grief-stricken lover, but the cold sweat of someone trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. And as the whispers grew into a storm of speculation, As the constable bent down to retrieve the letter, Jane Morrell could already sense it. This was no ordinary crime of passion. This was something far darker, and the truth, buried beneath layers of deception, was waiting to be unearthed. The girl's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes flickered, darting nervously between the lifeless body and the murmuring crowd, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, as if the air itself had thickened with unseen weight. Miss Jane Morrell stepped closer, her voice a soft murmur to the constable. "I'm afraid, sir," she said, her tone gentle but unwavering, "that Miss Worthington is not the only one with a reason to be nervous." The constable hesitated, his brow furrowing as though wrestling with an unspoken thought. "You believe," he trailed off, unable to voice the conclusion forming in his mind. Miss Morrell nodded slightly, eyes scanning the tense expressions around them. "I think," she said, measured and sure, "that everyone within these walls had a reason for wanting Mr. Ponton dead." Her pause was deliberate, and perhaps more importantly, they may very well have had the opportunity. Isabella Worthington was questioned first. Her distress was evident, tears welled in her eyes, her hands trembled, but Miss Morrell noticed the inconsistencies in her story, the subtle hesitations that spoke louder than any words. She spoke of a meeting that had never taken place, of plans that had supposedly been made and then discarded. Her voice held sorrow, yes, but was it grief, or something else entirely? "Miss Worthington," Miss Morrell's voice was light, almost casual, but her gaze was keen, probing. "You said Mr. Ponton did not respond when you called for him." Isabella nodded. "And you saw no one nearby?" "No," Isabella whispered, shaking her head, her voice barely above a breath. "No one." A silence settled between them before Miss Morrell finally spoke, her words slowly deliberate. "How curious," she murmured, her fingers lightly tapping her chin, "because I would have thought that Mr. Ponton's murderer would be someone he knew, someone he trusted." Isabella turned away, pressing a hand to her stomach, her complexion ghostly pale. She looked as though the weight of the moment might crush her entirely. Miss Morrell turned her attention to the letter, still trapped in Richard's stiff fingers. The hurried, almost desperate strokes of ink across the page suggested more than a simple fare. It spoke of urgency, of something that needed to be said before it was too late. But was it truly Isabella's hand that had written it, or was she merely one thread in a much larger tangled web? She turned to the constable. "I will need a closer look at the household," she said quietly. "If we are to uncover how this happened, we must first understand why." A small, knowing smile touched her lips, the kind that only a woman accustomed to unraveling riddles could wear. "After all," she added, her voice nearly lost in the wind, "the truth, as they say, is always hiding in plain sight. The Worthington estate was not a home, it was a fortress, one built of wealth, not warmth, and the sheer size of it seemed to mirror the distance between its inhabitants." Miss Marple paused at the wrought iron gates, her eyes tracing the sharp spires and cold grey stone. The architecture was grand, yes, but suffocating, as though the very walls conspired to keep their secrets buried deep. The door opened with a slow, protesting creak, and the heavy scent of polished wood and aged perfume greeted her like an unwelcome guest. It was the kind of place where silence reigned supreme, where wealth did not bring comfort, only careful posturing. A housekeeper led her through vast hallways where each step seemed to echo louder than the last. The walls, lined with portraits of Worthington ancestors, bore expressions frozen in rigid formality, watchful, judgmental, unyielding. Miss Marple felt their painted eyes on her, their presence lingering like unseen spectres. There was a weight to this place, a history not just of wealth, but of something darker, something that had long festered behind the estate's grand facade. The sitting room was a shrine to opulence, high ceilings, velvet drapery that let in only slanted ribbons of muted sunlight, furniture too fine to be comfortable. Shadows stretched long across the floor, the air thick with an unnatural quiet. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the household had collectively drawn back into itself, each occupant retreating to their own guarded corner. Miss Marple lowered herself into a plush armchair that swallowed her slight frame, the fabric sighing under her weight. The chair was large enough for three, yet no one joined her. Lady Catherine Worthington stood by the grand window, her back straight, her hands clasped behind her as though bracing herself against an invisible force. The woman was regal, poised, but Miss Marple saw past the carefully curated composure. Lady Catherine was not simply grieving. No, this was something else. This was a woman who knew more than she was willing to say. And as the heavy grandfather clock struck the hour, its chime ringing hollow through the quiet house, Miss Marple knew this investigation had only just begun. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood by the grand window, her hands clasped tightly before her, her pale complexion betraying no sign of sorrow. There was something rigid about her posture, as though an unseen weight pressed down on her shoulders, yet she bore it with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to carrying burdens too heavy to share. Miss Evelyn Harrow cleared her throat gently, her voice cutting through the suffocating silence. "Lady Ashford, might I inquire about Mr. Linwood's relationship with your daughter?" Eleanor's head turned ever so slightly, her expression unyielding, her gaze sharp. "I see no reason to discuss such matters," she replied coolly. "Marianne is well, has been well despite these unfortunate circumstances." Miss Harrow's lips curled into the faintest smile, though her eyes remained watchful, and yet, a union such as theirs would surely be of great interest to a mother. A flicker of something, irritation perhaps, crossed Lady Ashford's face, vanishing as swiftly as it appeared. "I never doubted Marianne's judgment," she said, her voice clipped. "But Linwood, he was not the match I envisioned for her." She let the words hang in the air like the scent of smouldering embers, laced with unspoken meaning. Miss Harrow did not press further. Instead she allowed the silence to settle, to stretch between them like a taut thread. There was something in Lady Ashford's careful detachment, something more than grief, something hidden, but that of course could wait. The door creaked open, and Theodore Ashford entered, his presence immediately unsettling. He was tall, his suit pressed but ill-fitted, as though he had shrunk within it. His hair was slicked back, yet a few rebellious strands defied his attempts at control. Though clearly no stranger to wealth, his manner suggested a certain discomfort with it. His eyes darted about the room, restless, never settling, like a man scanning the horizon for a storm he knew was coming. "Miss Harrow," he greeted, his voice a touch too loud for the room's stillness, as though trying to fill the space with something more than mere words. "I apologize for the state of the house. You know how it is, things have been rather complicated." Miss Harrow tilted her head ever so slightly. "Complicated," she echoed, letting the word linger, a single thread waiting to be pulled. Theodore shifted on his feet, his smile forced, brittle. "Oh, you know, the usual family matters. Marianne is well, she's upset of course, as she should be. And I have my own affairs to tend to." His fingers fumbled toward his pocket, but Miss Harrow's steady gaze halted the movement. "Mr. Ashford," she said, evenly, "you do not seem particularly troubled by your sister's distress." His eyes flicked toward Lady Eleanor, who remained impassive, her expression unreadable. Theodore straightened his posture, clearing his throat. "Of course I care," he said, though his voice lacked conviction, "but there are other things to consider. Financial matters, you understand." Miss Harrow did not need to ask. She could see it, the tension in his jaw, the weight of something unsaid pressing against his ribs. Money, always money, and now it seemed it had finally unraveled something beyond repair. She made a quiet note to probe further into Theodore's affairs. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," she said at last, her voice polite but razor-sharp. "I am sure Marianne is grateful for your concern." He gave a quick nod, casting one last glance toward his mother before exiting the room. Moments later, the heavy silence was broken by another presence. Dr. Oliver Caldwell entered, his demeanor calm, almost unnervingly so. He was a man who had seen much too much to be rattled by mere tragedy. His suit, though finely tailored, hung loosely on his frame, as though he wore it out of habit rather than comfort. His gaze was steady, his movements measured, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. "Miss Harrow," he greeted with a slight bow of his head. "I assume you wish to speak with me regarding Mr. Linwood." Miss Harrow folded her hands in her lap, her gaze unreadable. "Indeed, Doctor, I was just wondering." She let the words trail off, watching him carefully, noting the way his fingers tightened ever so slightly at his sides. "How long has it been since you last saw him alive?" The grandfather clock struck the hour then, its chime reverberating through the room like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. And as the sound faded, Miss Harrow knew, whatever had transpired within these walls, the truth was buried deep, and she would find it. Dr. Lawrence Whitaker adjusted his cufflinks with an air of detachment, his expression carefully composed, betraying no trace of unease. "I haven't known the Hargreaves long," he said, his voice measured. "Only through my work. Arthur came to me for a few consultations. Nothing serious, mind you." Miss Evelyn Harrow tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "You seem rather unaffected, Doctor," she noted, her tone light but sharp. "Most would be troubled by such an unfortunate event, Doctor." Whitaker offered a faint, practiced smile. "I've learned to separate my feelings from my profession, Miss Harrow. After all, I am a doctor, not a mourner." But Miss Harrow wasn't convinced. There was something too easy about his composure, too precise in its execution. It made her skin prickle. Their conversation meandered through safe, inconsequential topics, but Miss Harrow was certain Dr. Whitaker's words, though measured, carried the scent of a man carefully concealing something, and it wasn't merely a lack of feeling, it was something else entirely. By the time Miss Harrow left the Hargreaves' estate that afternoon, the air had turned sharp with an impending storm, the sky a dense muted grey, but the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. The deeper she delved into this house of wealth and whispered secrets, the more she sensed it, the tension hanging like a noose, the elegant lies wrapped in velvet and gold. The Hargreaves were hiding something, and as she reviewed her notes, she found herself wondering who among them would crack first. The kitchen was unsettlingly pristine, the sort of space that was maintained for appearances rather than use. The remnants of a fire sat cold in the hearth, the kettle resting on the stove, untouched. The stone floors, once warm with the lingering heat of busy hands, now felt like they carried the chill of the house itself. Clara, the young maid, perched at the edge of a wooden chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting like a sparrow caught in a too small cage. Miss Harrow lingered by the doorway, arms clasped behind her back, watching. Clara was nervous, that much was clear, but was it the weight of the situation pressing upon her, or was it something else? Something she dared not speak. The constable had already questioned her, of course. The expected inquiries: when had she last seen Arthur? Had anything unusual occurred that night? Clara had answered, but her words had been too neat, too deliberate, as if she had rehearsed them long before the questions were even asked. Miss Harrow let the silence stretch between them before finally speaking. "Tell me, Clara," she said, her voice soft but relentless. "What were your duties that evening?" Clara swallowed, her fingers tightening over the hem of her apron. I was in the kitchen, miss. Preparing dinner, mostly. I didn't see much else." Miss Harrow let the words linger, like the dying embers in the hearth, then took a step forward. "And you didn't hear anything?" "No voices, no disturbances." Clara shook her head, too quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It was quiet, like usual. There it was, that finality, too swift, too certain. It didn't fit the image of a household drowning in tension." Miss Harrow studied her, noting the way the girl's gaze flickered toward the door, her body angled ever so slightly away, as if she was ready to flee. Miss Harrow leaned on her cane, her voice turning softer, sharper. "Clara," she said, each syllable deliberate. "You know this house well, don't you? The garden too?" The maid hesitated, the faintest flush creeping into her cheeks, a tell. Miss Harrow's breath was steady. "And from the kitchen," she continued, "you would hear if something was amiss outside, wouldn't you?" Clara's fingers twisted into the fabric of her dress. The silence stretched long enough to feel like a held breath. Then for just the briefest moment, Clara's eyes flickered with something, fear, guilt, hesitation, and in that fleeting instant, Miss Harrow knew. Clara had heard something that night, something she wasn't meant to, and now all she had to do was find out what. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles turning white against the dark grain of the wood. "I wasn't outside, Miss Harrow," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't hear much." Miss Harrow's sharp gaze didn't waver, but if something or someone was close enough. She pressed her words gentle yet precise, like a scalpel sliding between ribs. Clara's breath hitched, a fraction of a second's hesitation that spoke louder than words. Guilt flickered in her eyes before vanishing behind the carefully constructed mask of a servant, accustomed to keeping her head down. She straightened, forcing a smile that barely reached her lips. "I told you, ma'am, I was busy, I didn't hear anything." The lie was flimsy, paper thin, and Miss Harrow let it sit in the thick silence between them, watching as Clara squirmed beneath the weight of it. "Tell me, Clara," she continued, her voice light yet laced with something inescapable. "When you first found Mr. Ainsworth's body, did anyone approach you? Did anyone seem upset? Unusual?" Clara's lip quivered as her fingers twisted in the folds of her apron. "No, ma'am, it was just me. I didn't see anyone else." A small lie, a convenient one. But Clara was no seasoned liar, and the cracks in her story were beginning to show. Miss Harrow pressed on, her voice unwavering, and when the police arrived, Clara hesitated, her gaze darting toward the door like a caged bird seeking an escape. "I didn't pay attention. I just did what I was told." "Did you?" Miss Harrow mused, tapping a thoughtful finger against her cane. "I wonder, Clara, if you might have overheard something more than you realize. Something that might help us understand what really happened to Mr. Ainsworth." The girl flinched at the suggestion, her wide eyes filled with a quiet panic. "No, ma'am, I swear I didn't hear anything. I was just doing my work." The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Harrow didn't need to say anything. She simply let the weight of the moment settle over Clara like a shroud. The girl's shoulders sagged, a breath escaping her lips as though she had been holding it in for too long. Relief flickered across her face before she stood abruptly, her movements too quick, too eager to leave. Miss Harrow watched her go, her gaze sharp as a blade. The girl wasn't telling the whole truth, but for now she would let Clara believe she had gotten away with it. The truth, Miss Harrow knew, had a way of slipping through the cracks, slowly at first, then all at once. As she turned to leave the kitchen, the cold stone floor seemed to amplify the unease curling in her gut. There was something about the way Clara flinched at the mention of the garden, something about the way she hesitated just a fraction too long. Someone was hiding something, and Miss Harrow was willing to wait, to watch, to pull at the threads until the whole tangled web unraveled. The Worthington estate was a grand thing, a place of beauty draped in velvet and gold, but beneath its polished surface lay a silence so thick, it made every sound echo just a little too loudly. As Miss Harrow walked through the dimly lit halls, her mind pieced together the fragments of the day, the maid's careful words, her nervous glances, the way she fumbled over small details. It all added up to something. The question was, what? Clara didn't seem the type to be part of a grand conspiracy, but secrets had a way of finding themselves in the hands of those least equipped to hold them. And in this house of quiet whispers and hidden sins, the truth was waiting, buried just beneath the surface, desperate to be uncovered. The drawing room of the Holloway estate sat in an eerie hush, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but rather watchful. Heavy brocade curtains swallowed most of the evening light, the dim glow of the chandelier casting long, restless shadows across the walls, the scent of polished wood, old paper and fading flowers clung to the air like ghosts of conversations long past. Eleanor Holloway sat stiffly in one of the high-backed chairs, her silk dress barely rustling as she shifted. Her fingers twisted and knotted in her lap, betraying a nervous energy that her carefully composed face tried to conceal. "You knew him well, didn't you, Miss Holloway?" Detective Harrow's voice was even measured, but there was something in the way she spoke, something precise and deliberate, like a blade pressing just hard enough to make the skin prickle. Eleanor's gaze lifted slowly, dark eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Yes," she murmured. "We were to be engaged. At least that was the plan." There was no warmth in her voice, just a hollow resignation. Harrow leaned forward slightly, watching the girl's every micro-expression. "And yet," she said, voice soft but unrelenting, "you hesitated." A slight flinch. It was barely there, but Harrow had trained herself to see these things, the smallest betrayals of truth slipping through the cracks of carefully placed words. Eleanor inhaled sharply, her breath catching for just a fraction of a second. "It wasn't that simple," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. She glanced away, eyes unfocused, lost in a memory. "My father, he wanted it more than I did. Julian was kind, but something always felt wrong." The room itself seemed to exhale with her confession, the chandelier's glow flickering as if responding to her words. "You intended to tell him," Harrow pressed. "The night he died." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles turning white. Silence wrapped around them, thick and suffocating. Then slowly, she nodded. "Yes, but when I went to the garden, he was already." Her voice broke. "I never got the chance." Harrow's gaze didn't waver. Grief was a peculiar thing. It clouded the mind, twisted memories, made people believe their own carefully constructed narratives. But something about Eleanor's hesitation, the way her voice wavered just at the wrong moments, made Harrow certain there was something else here. "Did you hear anything before you found him?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. A voice, a struggle. Eleanor opened her mouth as if to respond, but then something shifted. A door slammed shut in her mind. "No," she said, a little too quickly. It was silent, too silent. Harrow watched her carefully. Silence was as revealing as sound, sometimes even more so. It filled the spaces where truth should have been. "Your father," Harrow said, her tone deceptively light, "was very invested in this marriage. Would he have done something drastic if he believed Julian had wronged you?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Eleanor shook her head, but it was automatic, too rehearsed. "No," she said, but her voice cracked. He wouldn't, not couldn't. A crucial difference. Harrow caught the flicker of realization in Eleanor's expression, that moment of sudden doubt creeping in like a shadow in the corner of a well-lit room. "You're sure?" Harrow asked. "No one in your family, no one in this house had something to gain from Julian's death." Eleanor's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven rhythm. A silent war waged within her. She bit her lip, as if holding back something just at the edge of spilling. Harrow leaned back slightly, watching her struggle. It was always fascinating to watch people in these moments. The moment when doubt began to take root, when the story they had so carefully built began to crumble under the weight of unspoken truths. Outside, the Holloway estate loomed in the darkness, its towering stone walls etched with history. The house was old, its very foundations steeped in secrets. The halls whispered contradictions, the silence alive with the weight of things left unsaid. Harrow moved from room to room, her mind reconstructing the final hours of Julian Holloway. Every member of the family had a story, neat, composed, convenient. But truth had a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly one tried to bind it, and Harrow, she was patient enough to watch it come undone. Detective Ilara Graves moved through the opulent halls of the Holloway estate, the very air thick with the unspoken weight of deception. Every polished surface reflected more than just light, it reflected carefully curated facades. She started with Henry Vale, Richard Holloway's closest associate, a man who had built his reputation on charm and precision. He was seated in the grand parlor, his navy blue suit crisp, his demeanor impeccable, but there was something too composed about him, as if his elegance was meant to distract from the unease bubbling just beneath the surface. "You were with Richard just before his murder, weren't you?" Ilara's voice was smooth, calculated. She watched as Henry's expression barely shifted, just the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "That's right," he said, his voice even, almost rehearsed. "We had a drink, discussed business, the usual, and when did you leave him?" Henry's fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair. "Just before midnight. He wanted a moment to himself in the garden. I didn't see any harm in leaving him there." Ilara tilted her head, letting the silence stretch just enough to make him uncomfortable. "And after that," he hesitated. "Just a beat too long. I went back inside, poured myself another drink." A pause. "I was alone, alone. It was such a convenient thing to be, wasn't it?" A ghost of a smirk flitted across Ilara's lips. "And you didn't hear anything?" Henry exhaled, a tight, controlled breath. Nothing, not a sound. But his eyes betrayed him, darting, calculating, gauging her. Strange, Ilara mused, considering the gardener swears he heard voices in the dark, raised voices. Henry's jaw tensed, a flicker of something, irritation, fear. He recovered quickly, offering a practiced smile. "People misremember things all the time, detective." "Yes," Ilara agreed, her tone like silk laced with steel, "but not me." She let the words settle before moving on. Lady Beatrice Holloway's alibi was equally fragile. She had claimed to be in the library all night, reading, but no one had seen her there, no one had heard her there. Books, after all, did not make for alibi witnesses. "Detective," Beatrice greeted coolly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You were in the library all evening," Ilara said. Not a question, just a statement meant to invite contradiction. "Yes," Beatrice confirmed, but her tone lacked conviction. Ilara let a thoughtful hum escape her lips. "And no one interrupted you, not once?" Beatrice's gaze flickered, a microsecond of hesitation. "I was alone." "Another one. How curious." Ilara's next words were sharp, deliberate. "And how did you feel about Richard's engagement to your daughter?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Beatrice's fingers tightened ever so slightly, a telltale sign of restraint. "My feelings are irrelevant," Ilara smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. "On the contrary, Lady Holloway, when a man is murdered, nothing is irrelevant." A beat of silence, then just the faintest shift, an almost imperceptible tightening of her lips. Not much, but enough. By the time Ilara stepped outside, the estate felt different, as if it had begun to breathe around her. The gardens stretched out before her, too pristine, too sculpted, as if trying to erase the horror that had unfolded within them. The air carried a stillness that was unnatural, a hush that did not belong. The flowers stood in perfect symmetry, their beauty at odds with the violent truth buried in the soil beneath them. Secrets clung to this place, and Ilara Graves was going to dig them up, one by one. Detective Ilara Graves stood at the edge of the Holloway estate gardens, where the scent of roses still clung to the air, but something else lingered beneath it, a faint metallic trace, like the memory of something that should have faded but refused to let go. The night of the murder, the garden had not been peaceful. It had been waiting. The carefully manicured hedges, towering in their perfect symmetry, provided more than just beauty, they provided cover, a place where someone could slip in, unseen, unheard. The moonlight must have cast long shadows that night. twisting the figures of those who stood here into something almost inhuman. But there had been no screams, no signs of a struggle. Richard Holloway had not fought for his life. He had stepped into his own grave. Alara crouched where the body had been found, her gloved fingers hovering just above the disturbed grass. The imprint was deep, deliberate, not from a body collapsing, but from someone kneeling, waiting. The realization settled into her bones. He wasn't attacked here. The precision, the placement of his body, the utter lack of disorder, it all pointed to something cold and planned. Richard had been led here under the guise of a meeting, perhaps even a reconciliation, and then, when he had least expected it, death had come. Her gaze drifted along the path leading deeper into the garden. The flowers, still vivid, seemed almost wrong in their defiance against the death that had tainted this place. Their petals should have withered in mourning, and yet they stood tall, ignorant of the blood that had seeped into the earth beneath them. Nature forgets, but people don't. Somewhere among the perfectly arranged hedges, a betrayer had stood, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alara turned slowly, her mind running through the suspects. Who had the knowledge? Who had the opportunity? Who had the nerve? Henry Vale had been close to Richard, trusted by him, but there was always something too refined about men like him, men who played their roles a little too perfectly. Lady Beatrice, with her cold detachment, had reason to want Richard gone, and then there was Clara, the maid who seemed to have seen everything, yet spoken nothing. Too many people with too many motives. But one thing was certain, Richard had been led here deliberately, and whoever had brought him here had done so, knowing he would not leave alive. She stepped forward, her boots pressing into the soft earth, her eyes locked on the pathway winding deeper into the heart of the garden. The air was thick, heavy with something more than just the scent of roses. It was the weight of a secret that refused to stay buried, and Alara Graves intended to unearth it. The walls of Blackthorn Manor seemed to press inward, the dim candlelight casting flickering shadows across the parlour's grand tapestries. The air was thick, not just with the scent of aged mahogany and smouldering embers, but with secrets. Every polished surface reflected the faces of those gathered, their expressions frozen between grief and something far more dangerous: deception, betrayal. The aftermath of a crime woven into the very fabric of this house. At the center of it all stood Detective Alara Graves, her presence an unsettling contrast to the decadence surrounding her. She was not here to mourn, she was here to unravel. The suspects had been assembled like actors on a stage, their roles unspoken yet evident in the way they shifted beneath her gaze. Lord Sebastian Whitmore, the grieving son, his jaw tight with barely concealed resentment. Eleanor, his stepmother, poised with an icy grace that did little to hide the steel beneath. Nathaniel Grayson, the family lawyer, fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his chair, the sound like a ticking clock counting down to his own reckoning. And then there was Celeste, the housekeeper, silent, watching, knowing. She had seen more than she let on. She always had. Alara's voice, measured and deliberate, sliced through the suffocating tension. The truth, you see, has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. She moved toward the fireplace, the embers reflecting in her sharp eyes as she continued. Lord Whitmore did not simply vanish into the night. He was led to his fate, and someone in this room ensured he never returned. Sebastian's fists clenched. This is absurd. My father, he faltered, the weight of his own words pressing against him, was murdered. Alara finished, her tone soft but lethal. She let the words settle before shifting her attention. And yet, the stories I've been told, they do not align. Eleanor, you claim you were in the solarium all evening, yet a servant saw you near the east corridor, mere steps from the back garden, where his body was found. Eleanor's lips barely parted. I stepped out for air, that is not a crime. Alara tilted her head, her gaze piercing. Not unless you were meeting someone who wanted Lord Whitmore dead. A sharp inhale, a flicker of something fear, behind Eleanor's composed mask. She turned to Nathaniel next. And you, Mr. Grayson, your alibi is impeccable too. Impeccable. A man of your precision does not simply lose track of time in his study, while the master of the house is being murdered, mere yards away. Nathaniel's fingers stilled. I had no reason to harm him. No, and yet the changes in his will, surely you must have known. Or are we to believe that Lord Whitmore conveniently decided to amend his inheritance days before his untimely demise, without consulting his most trusted adviser? The silence that followed was louder than any confession. Alara let it stretch, watching as the weight of her words settled over them like a shroud. They were all tangled in this web, whether as conspirators or collateral damage remained to be seen. Her gaze lingered on Celeste, the quiet observer, the unseen thread binding these people together. She knows, but will she speak? The walls of Blackthorn Manor had held many secrets. Tonight, they would surrender one more. Ashbourne Hall had always been a fortress of wealth and influence, its grand halls echoing with the whispered secrets of those who resided within. But tonight, the air was different, heavier, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling of truth. The chandelier's dim glow cast long shadows across the velvet-draped drawing-room, where an audience of the guilty sat in forced silence. Their finely tailored suits and embroidered gowns could not mask the tension that coiled in their throats like a noose. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Hartley, calm yet unyielding, a woman who had spent her life navigating the labyrinth of human deception. Her sharp eyes flicked from face to face, watching how they held themselves, how their gazes darted to the corners of the room as if seeking escape, but there was none. Not tonight. She had gathered them all here for one reason: to expose the hand that had guided death into these halls. Across from her, Lady Rosalind Hertford sat stiff-backed in her chair, her usual air of icy authority beginning to show cracks. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested upon the arms of the chair, her knuckles pale beneath the pressure of her grip. Beside her, Alden Hertford, the calculating brother, shifted his weight, his nervous energy barely restrained. Beatrice, the niece, clutched the edge of her skirts, her breath uneven, and Henry Lockwood, the ever-trusted solicitor, stared at the ground, his jaw tense. Each of them had something to hide, but only one of them had taken a life. Evelyn allowed the silence to stretch, knowing it was often more damning than accusation. Then, with the precision of a blade, she spoke. "There's something that doesn't quite fit." Beatrice flinched. I don't understand." Evelyn's gaze remained steady. The letter, a breath caught in Rosalind's throat. A pause, just a second too long before she spoke. "What about it?" Evelyn stepped forward, her voice low but unwavering. It was meant to be a confession, a final message, left behind in haste. "But there's one glaring problem, the handwriting." Rosalind's fingers curled into the chair's fabric, her carefully maintained composure flickering. "You're mistaken," she said, her tone controlled but brittle. "The letter was found in Edmund's chambers. It was his own words, his final words." Evelyn's lips curved slightly, but there was no humor in it. "No. The strokes are inconsistent," the pressure hurried. "A forgery, meant to mislead. But most importantly, a letter meant to frame someone else. Someone innocent. You wanted us to believe that Edmund Hertford took his own life after a quarrel, that it was an impulsive act of despair." Alden straightened, his expression carefully blank. "And are you suggesting otherwise?" Evelyn turned her gaze toward him. "I'm not suggesting, Mr. Hertford. I'm stating a fact. Edmund Hertford did not write that letter, and he did not take his own life." A ripple of unease spread through the room. Henry Lockwood shifted uncomfortably. Alden exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching at his side, but Rosalind, she remained motionless. Evelyn's tone grew sharper. The letter was planted. The scene was staged. It was meant to send us in the wrong direction, to waste time searching for a guilt that was never his. And I believe, Lady Rosalind, you knew exactly what you were doing when you placed it where it would be found. Rosalind's mask of indifference cracked for the first time. You have no proof, she said, though her voice had lost its usual certainty. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Don't I? She took another step closer, her voice now a quiet force. Edmund uncovered something, didn't he? A truth so dangerous that it threatened everything you had built. Ashbourne Hall may seem untouchable from the outside, but behind these walls it was crumbling. You were drowning in debt, weren't you? Beatrice gasped, turning to Rosalind in shock. No, she whispered. Yes. Evelyn's voice carried no sympathy. Edmund found out. He learned that the grand facade was just that, a facade. The lavish parties, the extravagant purchases, the influence you wielded, it was all built on borrowed time, and he intended to expose it. He was going to tell the truth. Rosalind's nostrils flared. You know nothing. Oh, but I do. Evelyn's voice was like ice, and more importantly, so did Edmund. And that was your problem, wasn't it? He couldn't be allowed to speak. His silence became more valuable than his life. The room had grown impossibly still. No one moved, no one breathed. The weight of Evelyn's words pressed against them all, an invisible hand tightening around their throats. Rosalind's lips parted, but no sound came. Her gaze flicked to Alden, then to Henry, as if searching for an ally, but neither met her eyes. They were watching Evelyn now, transfixed, as she unraveled the final thread. You arranged to meet him in the study, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You pleaded, you threatened, but when you realized words would not be enough, you made a choice. You ended his life, and then you forged the letter, hoping it would be enough to divert suspicion. Rosalind's breath shuddered. I didn't mean, she swallowed, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Didn't mean to kill him. Evelyn echoed, her voice unrelenting. Perhaps, but you did. And then to save yourself you condemned someone else to take the fall. Rosalind's hands gripped the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned bone white. I had no choice, she whispered. Evelyn let the silence settle before she spoke again. No, Lady Rosalind, you had a choice. And you chose to end a life rather than face the consequences of your own actions. Rosalind's face was pale now, her breath shallow. The realization had set in. There was nowhere left to run. The others remained frozen. Alden's lips pressed into a thin line, his own guilt unspoken but palpable. Beatrice stared at her mother as if seeing her for the first time. Henry turned away. The grand halls of Ashbourne had always been filled with secrets. But tonight, they had been dragged into the light, and no amount of wealth or influence could hide them again. Evelyn let out a slow breath, and took one last look at the broken woman before her. I believe, she said, her voice steady, that this case is closed, and with that, the grand illusion of Ashbourne Hall crumbled. The halls of Blackwood Manor, once alive with the effortless grandeur of a family accustomed to power, now stood eerily silent, their polished floors reflecting only the fading remnants of what had been. The heavy air held a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn winds outside, punctuated only by the hushed murmurs of officers stationed in the grand entryway, their presence an undeniable reminder that the illusion of untouchability had finally shattered. Lady Eleanor Blackwood stood motionless, her back rigid but her hands clasped too tightly before her, the only betrayal of the storm raging within. Once she had commanded every inch of this estate, her mere presence breathing authority into its walls, but now she was just another name on a warrant. The weight of the truth had stolen something from her, something no wealth nor legacy could ever restore. Just a few steps away, Detective Celeste Harrow watched in silence, her sharp eyes taking in the minute shifts in Eleanor's expression, the flicker of something between defiance and resignation, the way her lips pressed into a thin line as if holding back words too dangerous to speak. The officers had already read her rights. The confession had come with a strange quiet, as though Lady Eleanor had known this moment would arrive, as though she had spent years dreading the day someone would finally ask the right questions. The truth had been a burden too great to carry alone. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the chief constable intoned, his voice steeped in formality, yet lacking the confidence of a man who had spent years turning a blind eye to the sins of the elite. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lawrence Sterling." She did not flinch, did not protest. She only nodded, her gaze vacant, too tired for pride, too spent for resistance. The control she had once wielded so effortlessly had been nothing more than a mirage, dissolving the moment truth clawed its way into the light. In the corner of the room, Genevieve Blackwood stood rigid, her face pale but composed, her eyes red but dry. She had been exonerated, the weight of false accusations lifted, but the damage had already been done. Whispers would follow her like a shadow, the taint of scandal staining her name no matter the outcome. The Blackwood dynasty had cracked, and with it so had the certainty she had once held in her place within it. "I never meant for this to happen," Lady Eleanor whispered suddenly, her voice raw with something that might have been regret. Her gaze drifted toward her daughter, searching for something, understanding, forgiveness, absolution, but Genevieve remained silent, her expression unreadable. "I did what I thought I had to do." Celeste watched them both, the unspoken weight between them, thick as the dust that clung to the ancient chandeliers above. Lady Eleanor's actions had been born of desperation, but desperation did not erase intent. A choice had been made, and now it had cost her everything. Outside, the carriages departed one by one, and the house, stripped of its grandeur, felt impossibly empty. Genevieve sat by the drawing-room window, her fingers tightly laced in her lap, watching the overgrown gardens shift in the wind. The fire in the hearth crackled, but it did little to warm the cold that had settled into the bones of the estate. Celeste entered the room quietly, her steps careful, measured, as though she were stepping through the wreckage of something irreparably broken. She lowered herself into the seat across from Genevieve, neither of them speaking at first, the silence between them stretching long and heavy. "Detective Harrow," Genevieve finally murmured, her voice steady but thick. "I don't know what to say." Celeste studied her carefully, the sharp lines of her face, the way her posture remained too still, too controlled. She had seen it before, the way grief settled into those who had been forced to let go of the illusions they had once clung to. "You don't have to say anything," Celeste said softly. "This was never your burden to carry." Genevieve's eyes flicked to hers, something unreadable shifting in their depths. "But it is my burden," she countered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my family, my name. I can't just pretend it didn't happen." Celeste held her gaze, the firelight casting long shadows between them. "No," she admitted, "you can't undo what's been done, but you can choose not to be defined by it." Genevieve's brow furrowed, uncertainty flickering through her expression. "What are you saying?" Celeste leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but kind. "I'm saying you don't have to stay here. This house, this name, none of it has to hold you in place. You can walk away. Start again. The past will always be there, but it doesn't have to dictate your future." Genevieve exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders loosening just slightly. She turned back to the window, watching the shifting light over the garden, as if searching for something beyond the estate's towering iron gates. "And where would I even go?" she whispered, though there was something almost hopeful in the question, as if she were only just realizing she had a choice at all. The grand estate, once a monument to power and prestige, now stood draped in an eerie silence, its towering walls echoing with the weight of secrets too long buried. The soft glow of the moon cast long ghostly shadows over the marble floors, but the light did little to chase away the cold that had settled deep within its walls. Outside, the flashing red and blue of police lanterns painted the mansion in a grim, unnatural glow, a silent testament to the truth that had finally surfaced. Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft, a woman who had once commanded every room she entered, now stood motionless, her fingers twisting together in a gesture of quiet defeat. The weight of the past had finally caught up with her, and there was no escaping it now. The voice of Inspector Graves cut through the stillness like a blade. "Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft, you are under arrest for the murder of Alexander Crowther." There was no outburst, no frantic denial, just a slow, measured breath as Eleanor closed her eyes for a fleeting moment. Perhaps, deep down, she had known this moment would come. "I only needed more time," she murmured, almost to herself. "I only needed time," but time had never belonged to anyone. Inside the dimly lit drawing room, Isabella Ravenscroft sat rigidly by the window, her face pale, her fingers clutched tightly together. The accusations, the scandal, the unbearable whispers, she had endured them all. Though her name had been cleared, the stain remained, an invisible mark that would never fully fade. Across from her, Miss Ashbourne watched her carefully, her expression unreadable. "The past always finds a way back to us, no matter how desperately we try to bury it," she said softly. Isabella exhaled sharply, her voice hollow. "And now," she asked, "now that it's all over, where do I go?" Miss Ashbourne's gaze did not waver. "Wherever you choose to." A pause. Then Isabella's eyes flickered with something fragile, something lost. "And what will I find there?" "A destination is only what you make of it," Miss Ashbourne replied, her voice gentle yet firm. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering patterns across the walls, as if the house itself was fading into its own memories. Outside, the sound of footsteps grew distant, Lady Eleanor's silhouette swallowed by the cold, indifferent night. Soon all that remained was silence and the distant hum of the wind sweeping through the estate, carrying with it the echoes of a past that could never be rewritten. The road stretched before her, winding through the mist-laden countryside, the village now a mere shadow behind her. Miss Evelyn Hawthorne pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders as the chill of the early morning air pressed against her skin, but it was not the cold that unsettled her, it was the lingering weight of the past few days. The manor stood distant on the hill, its once proud silhouette now faded into the haze, no longer the beacon of power and grandeur it had once been. The Darlington family had fallen, their secrets dragged into the open, their name forever tainted by the truth that had unraveled within those walls. Lady Margaret Darlington, the once regal matriarch, had been taken away, her final look not one of defiance but of something else, emptiness, a resignation that came only when one realized that the past could never be undone. Evelyn's mind replayed the moment, those dark hollow eyes staring through her, as though seeing something far beyond the confines of the present. What had she truly lost? Was it reputation, wealth, or was it something deeper, something that could never be reclaimed? Evelyn had seen it before, the slow unraveling of those who built their lives upon illusions. The lies once so carefully woven had turned to dust in her hands, and the weight of them had crushed everything beneath it. She reached the crossroads where she had first arrived, pausing for a brief moment. The case had been solved, the guilty exposed, yet there was no sense of triumph in her heart. Justice was a cold thing, often unkind in its execution. What remained in its wake were broken lives, empty halls, and whispers that would linger long after she was gone. The Darlington estate would stand, but it would never be the same. The legacy they had fought to protect had become their undoing, their downfall not written by fate, but by their own desperate hands. A gust of wind carried the scent of damp earth and decayed leaves, a fitting requiem for a house that had buried its secrets too deep. Evelyn turned her gaze once more to the village. It too would recover, its people settling back into their quiet routines, their eyes forever holding the shadow of what had passed but their lips never daring to speak of it. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. There was always another mystery waiting in the distance, another lie waiting to be unraveled, another desperate soul clinging to the hope that the truth would never find them, but the truth always did. It crept through the cracks, whispered through the silence, and eventually, no matter how deeply buried, it would rise. Evelyn Hawthorne did not need to look back. The story of the Darlingtons was over, but somewhere someone else was already waiting for their story to begin.